Okay, now we're on page 41 in the book. The book, I tweak it from time to time, and I added a couple of points. We got into a discussion of using mathematical probability to prove the existence of God, or that the Bible is God's word, using scientific arguments. And I pointed out that the problem with that argument is that some people don't understand mathematical probability. And the argument's strong, and very weighty arguments are good. They're good arguments, but a lot of people don't understand how strong they really are. And so what I did is I had written a treatise on it, so I put an extra appendix in the book, okay, which appendix, and I have another appendix now I've added to the book, which has these scientific arguments and explains them and shows how they work. You don't have to have a degree in mathematics to understand them, okay? So that's what I did, and so I've added that to the book. And after class tonight, I'll go ahead and send that copy to you. But now let's go back to page 40. Let's go back to our square of opposition chart. And of course, we have an A-type proposition, all S are in. An E-type proposition, both these are universal, and no S are in. And then we have a particular, some S are in, and some S are not in. This particular right here, all Christians are baptized believers. John Doe is a Christian, a particular person. John Doe is a Christian, therefore he's a baptized believer. Does that make sense? We've just applied this general universal point to some particular person. That's what we mean by calling it particular. And the same thing with the universal negative. No atheists, no infidels are baptized believers. And so right here, no infidels are baptized believers. John Doe is an infidel, so he's not a baptized believer. Now, he might have been baptized, but if he's an infidel, he's not a believer. And so we would argue then that he's John Doe, a particular person of that group, is not a believer. And so that would be implied by this other one. This is just one particular person out of this group up here that we've applied it to, and that's what it means, right? So if I prove that everybody who has remission of sins has been baptized, then I come down here and I say, this person has remission of sins. I prove he's been baptized. If this one is true, and I would argue from Acts 2:38, all those who have remission of sins have repented and been baptized. And then I can argue down here that those of Ephesians 2 had remission of sins. Therefore, this is implicit proof that they had repented and been baptized. Does that make sense, what we're saying? Everybody clear with that? So this implies this, but you can't go the other way. All right, now we go back. We're down here on this. We looked at two propositions being independent of each other. We got down to this point. And I will have some homework material to just some practice exercises. Basically, it's homework, but it's exercises. I'll be sending those out to you, and then we'll look at those at the beginning of class, next class period. And I'll probably be having exercises with each lesson from now on. Okay, all right. To be logically equivalent, now we need to look at equivalency. Either both propositions are true or both are false, okay? And so that's a little more beyond what we're ready for right now. So Appendix C shows some things that are equivalent. And so we'll be looking at these as we develop into this chapter. We'll see some here in this chapter and later chapters particularly. We'll expand that more fully. So this right here is, we're not going to try to explain it right now. But both are true or both are false. And so to be equivalent, they have to both be true and both be at the same time. Both are false. They're either both false or they're both true. one or the other, right? Two propositions are independent if the truth or falsity of one has nothing to do with truth or falsity of the other, all right? So if they're independent, neither one can imply the other. One can't imply the other. In other words, we couldn't go back up here and say the I-type proposition is not independent of the A-type proposition. Why? Because the A implies the I, and the E implies the O, so they're not independent. So they can't be a relationship. They can't be related in the fact that that one can't be a contradiction of the other. The claim that all of those who have remission of sins have repented and been baptized, Acts 2:38, is falsified if you find somebody who repented, who had remission of sins, who had either not repented or not been baptized. If he had remission of sins, and the Bible told us he did, see. But we don't find that. That doesn't exist. And so this is a true statement. All those who have remission of sins have repented and been baptized. Now, it's not telling you that's everything they did, but we guarantee from Acts 2:38 that they did those two things. That's a guarantee. Does that make sense? Everyone, any questions? Now, to be independent, neither proposition can imply the other, and the proposition must be consistent with each other. Now we need to go back to what consistent means. And so let's go back up here to the definition of consistent. They both may be true at the same time. They're consistent, and they cannot be contradictory, and they can't be contrary to one another. All right? So they can both be true at the same time. In other words, all those who have remission of sins or those who have repented and been baptized is contradicted by some have either not repented or not been baptized, but they have remission of sins. Okay? And so we lay that out for us. Now, of course, people try to use some of the instances in before the cross. And that's, of course, this is after the cross. Keep that in mind. Be aware of that. So right there we have they would contradict one another, right? All right. And of course, the A and the E propositions can't both be true at the same time. You can't say all American citizens are those who have the right to vote, and no American citizens are those who have the right to vote. Those cannot both be true at the same time. All can't be true of something and no be true of something. All those who are saved are believers, and nobody that's saved is a believer. See, those would be definitely, both couldn't be true. And they're just basically almost like they're contraries to each other, contrary to one another. That's what contrary means. They can't both be true at the same time. Contradiction, when one is true, the other one is false. That's the difference to the contrary. They both can't be true at the same time, but they could both be false. Whereas contradiction, if one is true, the other one's false. So if the A is true, the O is false. If the O is true, the A is false. And if the E is true, the I is false. If the I is true, the O is false. And the E is false. So those are contradictions. So to be consistent, they can't be contradictory and they couldn't be contrary to one another. So let's go back now. See it right here. I'm spending some time on this because I'm going to use these terms, and it's kind of important that we know the terms. You probably have guessed it. Your exercises will be a little bit of the definitions of these terms a bit. All right. For two propositions be independent, neither can imply the other, and they must be consistent with each other. For example, the proposition the children of Israel were required to observe the Sabbath day in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, Exodus 28:11, Deuteronomy 5:12-15. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, and he goes on to explain some more. they're required to. And this proposition is independent of the proposition the Lord's church is not required to observe the Sabbath day. Colossians 2:16 tells us that, for it says, let no man therefore judge you in meat or in drink or in respect of a feast day or a new moon or a Sabbath day. So don't let them judge you in respect to those things. And of course, in Galatians 4:8-11, we have it as well. Howbeit at that time, not knowing God, you were in bondage to them that by nature are no gods. He's talking about Gentile converts. But now that you have come to know God, you have obeyed the gospel, in other words, or rather to be known by God, how turn you back again to the weak and beggarly rudiments, whereas you desire to be in bondage over again. You ought to go back and obey the law of Moses, because these Judaizing teachers are trying to get you to be circumcised and keep the law of Moses. And the book of Galatians tells what their motive was, and you have to study it more thoroughly. And he says, ye observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid of you, or for you, better translation. Lest by any means I have bestowed labor upon you in vain. So again, the observing of the Sabbath days is probably involved in this as well. From the context, that would be probably a clear-cut conclusion. These propositions are independent because they're based on laws that were either under two different dispensations, and Sabbath keeping was neither bound under the New Testament nor even under the patriarchal law. So it was not bound. Sabbatarians will claim it started in Eden, but it didn't. So that's something that is argued. They're trying to make it a universal a law applicable to all dispensations. Even if it was binding under the patriarchal, which it wasn't, doesn't mean that they've proven it's binding today. Now we have sub-implication, which we've already looked at. The universal affirmative A-type proposition implies a particular affirmative proposition. So let's go back up to it. I'm going to use Acts 2:38. Let me use Mark 16:15 and 16. Baptized shall be saved. All those who are saved are those who have believed and been baptized. That's what that's saying. That's your A-type proposition. So John Doe is one who is saved. John Doe is one who has believed and been baptized. That's what that's saying. That's not saying that's all he's done. It's just guaranteeing he's done those two things. All right? Let me illustrate this. If you have a driver's license, you're probably 16 years old or whatever your state requires, and you pass the test. Now, if you pass the test, you probably weren't blind. Okay. We could say some other things about you. Probably weren't totally unable to move yourself whatsoever and control the steering wheel. There are probably other things that we could say about you. And so when we do this, we're saying that you did these things, and there may be other things that you did too that were necessary for you to get that license. Okay. And saying that you passed the test is a requirement. And I know if you have the driver's license, if it's not just you cheated somehow, you passed the driver's test. At least you did in Oklahoma, there was a driver's test that I had to pass. Okay. Now we go back down here now. We look at this. We have the sub-implication, it's called. The universal affirmative A-type proposition implies the particular affirmative. So if all those who are saved are those who believe and have been baptized, then we can say then that those of Ephesians 2 who were saved had believed and been baptized. Is that reasonable? Anybody have a problem with that? I'm not saying that that's all they did. I'm just saying I'm guaranteeing that they did those two things. That's all the guarantees. That's your A-type proposition. And with E-type proposition, no person who was saved is an unbeliever. All right, no unbeliever is a saved person. And so we could say that one unbeliever We can name some person as an unbeliever. We can say he's not a saved person. You choose John Doe. John Doe is an unbeliever, is not a saved person. And that's all it guarantees. I just picked one out of that group of unbelievers. So that's my E-type. No unbeliever is a saved person. That's a true statement. And so we can say that John Doe is an unbeliever, is not a saved person. We made it particular to one, applicable to one single person, or maybe even a small group of that subgroup, of that major group. Are there questions? That's what we mean by sub-implication. Right? Now we have super-implication. Two things are implied. If the particular affirmative proposition I is false, it implies the universal affirmative is false. And if the particular negative proposition, the O-type proposition, is false, it implies that the universal negative is false. And we're going to go back to our square of opposition to see it. This is a little harder to see, but it's clear once we see it right here. Of course, all saved people are those who believe and been baptized, and John Doe, or they can just use those of Ephesians. Well, let me just go back and let's just say the Ethiopian eunuch is one who was saved, Acts 8. The Bible does not explicitly say he believed, but by implication, I know he was baptized, so I can prove he believed by proving from Mark 16, 15, and 16 that all those who are saved are those who have believed and been baptized. The eunuch was saved, therefore I know he believed. And the scriptures explicitly tell me he was baptized. So I now can prove by implication that he also believed. I could go to Acts 2:38 and argue that remission of sins is the same as being saved. And if I could show that those are equal, then I could argue then that the Ethiopian eunuch also repented. I know he was baptized, and I could say all those who repent and are baptized are those who have remission of sins. The Ethiopian eunuch is one who had remission of sins. Therefore, the Ethiopian eunuch is one who had repented. Does that make sense? Anybody not see that? That's how I can prove the plan of salvation is applicable to every instance. And when a person is saved, our preaching brethren have preached the plan of salvation ever since I was knee high to a grasshopper. I was hearing it when I was a young pup back in probably about 1947 or 48. I was hearing it and remembered it, and so that's quite a while ago. And I believe they were preaching the truth on this. Now let's go back up here. Now let me say this. Let's go up here to all those who are saved, or those who are believers. So let's just say they believe. All those who are saved are those who believe. And even our Calvinist friends would agree with that. So I could falsify that by saying some of those who are saved are unbelievers, or those who do not believe. Well, now we can't prove that. That's not true. But that would contradict the A-type proposition. All those who are saved are believers. If I found one that was saved who wasn't a believer, which we can't do. So now these contradict each other. Also, the I-type proposition contradicts the O-type proposition. No saved person is an unbeliever. And, okay. All right. And we could say some saved person is, no saved person is a believer, we could say. Atheists could argue that, or someone could argue that. And I could falsify it by proving that a particular saved person was a believer. And so that would falsify that. No saved person is a believer, and I can prove that one person is. I can prove that others are too. But see, these would falsify each other. Now watch what happens. If the I-type proposition is not true, then that automatically proves the E-type proposition, because these are contradictory. So if this is falsified, this is super implication, it's called, Let's go back and look at it. We'll come right back up in just a minute. Super implication. If the particular affirmative I is false, it implies the universal affirmative A is also false. Now, how does that do that? Let's look at it. If this is false right here, I-type proposition, then it contradicts the E-type proposition. So if this is false, then the E has to be true. Everyone see that? Anybody not see that? All right. Now, by being contrary propositions, the E and the A proposition, they both can't be true at the same time. So if the E is true, by virtue of the I being false, then it being true, being contrary to the A can't be true. So if the I proposition is false, it means the A is false. Now, if the I is true, it doesn't mean the A is true, but we only have proven that it's false. Does that make sense? Everyone see that? Any problem? Same thing happens over here. If the O-type proposition is false, then that means the A-type proposition is true. And since the E is the contrary to it, they both cannot be true, can't both be true. So if the A is true, the E has to be false. So if the O is false, that means the A is true. So the E cannot be true. It has to be false. So that's your super implication. So this goes up on a negative form, but it doesn't go up in a positive form. I does not imply A, but I not being true would mean A can't be true. All can't be true if one of them is not true. Does that make sense? That's pretty simple. All right. All believers, all those who are saved are believers. Now that's a true statement. If I found one that's a believer, it was false that one was a believer, that would mean he's an unbeliever and he can't be saved. So that would falsify it. If this were true, if this were false down here, someone, you could find one that wasn't a believer that was saved, then automatically up here you would falsify this. Okay. And someone might say, well, what about little children? Well, little children never have been lost. So I'm not a Calvinist. See, I don't have a problem with it. Okay. Any questions? All right. Now then, let's go back up here. Super implication. Now, we get into when we frame an argument, when we frame it. And when we frame it, we need to have three basic rules. There are three basic rules we need to have. Number one, propositions must begin with either the words all, some, or none. Or no, it could be no, but or none. All, some, or none. And that's your proposition has to be one of those three. And so it has to be either universal or particular. All right. Some is particular, and universal is all or none or no. Okay. So you have to have a proposition that has to be worded in one of those two forms. All right. Now, both the subject and predicate must be either a noun or a noun clause. It must be either a noun or a noun clause. So we always convert them into a noun or a noun clause. Now, we're going to practice on this and see what we're talking about here in just a minute. The verb joining the two terms must be a being verb, such as is, are, was, were, and so forth. Now, in Appendix A, I have the conjugation of all the being verbs, English being verbs, the full conjugation of all the tenses. So Appendix A, you can go to that appendix and see what I'm talking about with being verbs. So I won't go back and look at them is, was, and are, and so forth, and were. Okay. Questions so far? These are your three rules that you need to have here. And of course, I have a space here. I'm going to save it, just to save it. All right. Now, here's an example. We have every zebra is striped. All right, every zebra is striped. Now, what we have here is every is not one of our words. It's not all, some, or none. Now, every sounds like all, but it's not. So every zebra, we need to change every to the quantifier all. And that would be all zebras are striped. We change the is to are striped. Now we've gotten the right quantifier, all, and we've changed the is to are. Is was acceptable, but are, what we need is are to make the grammar good. And they're both interchangeable, or they're both being verbs, are striped. Now we still got a problem. We've got two of our rules taken care of. Proposition 1 must begin with an all, some, or none. This begins with all. That's okay now. We need the rule number 3. We need a being verb, which we have there with are. That's good. But the second rule, both the subject and the predicate must be either a noun or a noun clause. Well, striped is not a noun. Striped is an adjective. So we need to change it. And so we need to change it. The first, all zebras are striped, only fulfills 2 of these 3. Begins with one of the 3 required quantifiers, all. And the 2 terms joined by the being verb are. And so that's good. However, the predicate is neither a noun nor a noun clause. It's an adjective, striped. So I can change this now. The standard form is that all zebras are striped animals. Now, what we get into is you don't have to, in your writings, you could write all zebras are striped. That's okay. But when we're going to put it in the form of a logical argument, we need to have it in these 3 forms. So if you're reading what someone has written, you may have to rewrite what they've written or what they've said. If you're listening to a tape or watching a recording of someone, you might have to rearrange what they've said into the logical form in order to evaluate it. And so this is important for evaluating arguments that you read, because people don't write everything in a strict logical form. And that doesn't mean that their writings are wrong. It's just that they don't normally write it the way we are writing it. You wouldn't write all zebras are striped animals. Most people say every zebra is striped. That would be acceptable, and they'd go right on with it and be through with it. Any questions or comments?
So basically, go ahead.
Well, I'm just saying, every zebra is striped is a good statement. Nothing wrong with it. But it's just not in the form that we want to use to evaluate it when we're trying to evaluate arguments. That makes sense?
So the reason to use the word all rather than the word every is because of the accepted standardized form that you want to place logical arguments in.
Yes.
Understanding that all and every are equivalent.
Yes.
But it's just the format that's standard and accepted.
Yeah, we got a standard format. Once you get used to the standard format, then you can look at it very quickly and tell something wrong with it. Does that make sense? Okay. You can easily find the flaw in it, or you can see it's good. It's a sound argument or a valid argument. So this helps you to recognize once it's in this standard form. If we put everything in standard form, it's easy to evaluate it and to look at it and say, okay, it's correct, it's valid. And then we can decide whether the premises are true. If it's valid, properly constructed by the rules, by the proper forms, and then the premises are true, it's a sound argument, and the conclusion is true. Does that make sense? That's what we're doing it for. That's good observation. Any other comments? Here's the second example. Many Christians are women. Well, many is an unacceptable quantifier. Well, it's vague. It's not clear. Many is how many? Well, so we can weaken it a little bit and say, we can say some Christians are women. Well, that's a good. Now then, many Christians are women, and many, we don't know how many that is. That's it's a vague word. So if we change it to standard form, some Christians are women. What I'm saying with some, at least one. I'm not guaranteeing more than one. I'm just saying one is. And if I can prove that, I could say, here's a woman who's a Christian, and the Bible lets me know she's a saved person. I believe saved people in the New Testament are called Christians, right? Faithful children of God are called Christians, okay? And so I would argue then that if I could prove she's a saved person and she's faithful child of God, then I could prove she's a Christian. So this woman, some woman, I would pick some woman in the New Testament, and I think Dorcas would be a good illustration of this. If I could prove she's saved, then I prove she's a Christian. And so here's a Christian woman. At least one Christian woman one Christian is a woman. And I think Dorcas would be a good example. I think that Priscilla probably would be, and we could go on with some others, okay? Any questions? So again, we just had to make one correction with this, get rid of the many and put it as some. Now these some and many are not exactly equivalent, but some is too vague for us to fit into our logical arguments. Many is, but some will work. Some just means one or more. It could even be all. All would qualify. Some would qualify under the heading of all. If so, all are, then one is. One of that group is if all Christians, let's say all faithful elders are Christians, then I could say John Doe is the faithful elder, must be a Christian. Does that make sense? All right. Now let's go to our third argument. None of the students in this class passed the last exam. I just made up a sentence. We need to change the word none to no. None won't fit here. And so no, and so we properly modify the noun students. No students in this class passed the exam. So we made one change. We changed it to no students. That'll fit the form we use. This form is still not acceptable because in this class, passed exam needs to be changed to a noun or noun equivalent. We also need a being verb to link the terms. So we could say, no students in this class are exam passers. That's a noun. That's a noun now. Now that's awkward wording, and it seems awkward, and it is. It's not good prose, and they wouldn't write that. They could say none of the students in this class pass exam. That's a perfectly good statement. But when we're going to evaluate it, we need to put it like this. No students in this class are exam passers. And so we arrange it, what others have said or written, into proper form so we can evaluate whether their arguments are sound or not. And I believe you got the point that I was making. That's what you need to do. That's why you need these rules here. Any questions or comments? All right. So now, let's look at constructing an argument. We have what we call categorical syllogism. That's the first one we're going to look at. It arranges things into categories and groups them into categories. Well, every sound argument contains a valid syllogism with premises that are true and other sound logical other sound logical argument. All right. So we have a valid syllogism with premises that are true or other sound logical argument. Now, we might not have a syllogism as a logical argument, okay? So there's other kinds of logical arguments. All right, let me illustrate this. If A is greater than B and B is greater than C, then A is greater than C. Does that make sense? If man is greater than animals and God is greater than man, then God is greater than animals. Does that make sense? Everyone see what I'm saying? So that's not a syllogism. That's a principle of greater than. Something's greater than something else. The New Testament is greater than the Old Testament, than the law of Moses. And that's laid out in the book of Hebrews. That's one of the arguments for it. If it's greater, then you shouldn't go back to the law of Moses for your justification because you're leaving the greater to go to the lesser. That's one of his arguments there. And we'll get into that later, but that's just one, that's another one. That's another sound logical argument that I just made was greater than, okay? All right. Now, a valid argument is one that's constructed by the rules of logic. Now, we have here to be a categorical syllogism, and I cite Hurley, Barker, and Copey, all 3 pages where they give this. There's exactly 3 terms, each of which appears twice in distinct propositions, and each of the 3 terms must be used in the same sense throughout. You can't change the meaning of a word in that argument. That's called equivocation. You equivocate, you change its meaning. The middle term is distributed. Now, that's important. It has the word all, every, or none, or no, or none, modifying it at least once. Now, we'll have to define what the middle term is. Now, this is where we'll start on it today, and we'll come back to it later, next week. A conclusion, and number 3, it has to have a conclusion that is negative if one of the terms is negative. Right, so we have 3 terms. We have a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. And so if either the major or the minor premise is negative, the conclusion has to be negative. You can't get a positive conclusion from one of the negative premises. All right, a negative premise requires a negative conclusion. That conclusion requires a negative premise. Does that make sense? All right, now, these men don't exactly word it this way. I've kind of summarized it. No more than 1 negative premise. You can't have 2 negative premises and get a conclusion. There's no conclusion can be derived. You've got 2 negative premises. Now, we'll go through these and explain them and show how they work. All right. Number 5, conclusion is distributed. Now, that means it has the word all, each, or every, or for each, or every, modifying it only if both the middle term and the minor term are distributed. They have those words modifying them. If both premises, number 6, are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. It has to be universal. All right, any question? There are 6 rules. Now, there exist several valid, properly constructed forms of syllogisms, and we'll categorical syllogism. We're going to take 4 basic forms, and that will help you as you go through. These are the 4 that you can put most of your arguments into. And so what we'll do is we'll look at these 4 basic forms, we'll study them, and then we'll add some more later. All right? Any questions so far? We'll have to come back to these up here just later, okay? We'll come back and reuse them and illustrate them. Here's the first form right here. All right? And it goes major premise, and I'll say all S are in. There's a reason for me using the letters S and N. We'll get to that in chapter 6, and it will help us, once we've covered chapter 6, it'll help us to kind of see what's implied by this. Usually they use P's and Q's, all P's or Q's or something like that. Sometimes they'll all say all S's or P's. But I'm going to use S and N. All S's are in. C is an S. All C are S's. And then all C's are N's. Okay? I will illustrate this with examples. We just use letters in it for right now. Now, remember, S has to be a noun or a noun clause, okay? R is your being verb. We have a all, and all. Now, it goes back up here. Let's see that all here. Let's see. If both premises are universal, the conclusion cannot be particular. It's universal. All. You couldn't have some down here in this right here, okay? Come over here to all S are in. Some C are S, and then some C are in. So right here, if you have a particular premise, one of your premises particular, then your conclusion has to be particular. I'm not seeing it here. Let me see right here. All right, I'll find it. Okay, here, number 5. Conclusion is distributed as the word all only if both the middle and the minor term are distributed. All right. And so if one of those terms is not distributed, not universal, then it can't be, the conclusion can't be universal. So we have some, okay? All right. Now, here's negative ones. This is your A type, and this is your I type. Here, A, I. This is an A type proposition, 3 A's. All right. Now then we have here an A type proposition, all S are in, no C are in, and then no C or S. All right. So right here, you have a negative and a negative, one negative premise. Remember, you can't have 2 negative premises. The one negative premise means your conclusion is negative. Okay. That's a universal negative A, universal affirmative A, universal negative, and so you have a universal conclusion. All right. Universal affirmative, all S are in, some S are not in. So that's an A, E, and E type proposition, A, E, E. All right. This over here is an all S are in. It's an A type proposition. Some C are not in. That is an O type proposition. And some C are not S. So that's an O type proposition. So we can identify these propositions by their letters that go with them. And so we have an A, I, A, E, E, A, O. So those are the forms of those arguments. And we can just look at them and say those are valid forms. We can prove it. I can prove they're valid. Right? The square of opposition will show that they're valid. In these 3 valid syllogisms, there's exactly 3 terms. So we have 3 terms. Now, what are your 3 terms? S, it's twice. N is twice. C is twice. Each one is there, and each one is found twice. Right? Right? And the S term is called the middle term because it is the middle, the thing that joins the 2 together. And the S term is the middle term. It's only in the premises. It's not in the conclusion. Notice S is never in the conclusion. Right here. S, 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 S. And N is your middle term here. It's not in the conclusion. Right? N is your middle term here. It's in both of them. It's not in the conclusion. So your middle term here is S. S. The middle term here is N. It's in both these right here. So the term it's in both premises but not in the conclusion is the middle term. Okay.
So what would the not S be in relation to S?
Well,
because that's not S, N, or C.
Well, we'll just have to examine it to see if it's valid. We can do that with square of opposition. We're going to play with them, a bunch of them, and just lay them out and show you how they're invalid, how they won't get a correct answer. Let me go back up with the square of opposition. We can see it. If my conclusion, if I start out with all S are in, and I draw my final conclusion, some S are not in, I know that the conclusion is wrong because the first premise says all S are in, can't contradict the conclusion. Does that make sense? So we can examine it and say, okay, I can't have a conclusion that would say we could have a AAO won't work. I can't get an O conclusion with the premise that's A. Does that make sense? Can't get that. All right. Unless I have a negative in here somewhere to negate it. I'd have to negate it somehow. All right. But these two can't be true. I can't negate this with this by making both of them true because they can't both be true. See? So now our square of opposition will tell us this argument is not sound. It's not a sound argument. So I can take a person's argument with my square of opposition. Once they get good at it, I can look at it and say, okay, it's just not a sound argument. I can show why it's unsound. And that's what we're going to do. And you're not ready for it yet. So, but we'll get to that. I think we'll get to it where you can see it and you'll be able to recognize it. All right. There's 256 forms. Okay. And only about 17 of them are actually valid. And we'll show why much of them are not valid. All right. Back over here. I don't know if I answered your question thoroughly enough. I'm not trying to put you off, but we can see you can't have two negative premises, for example, and we'll show that. And I'll discuss this down here a little more as we go through. Okay, I think we'll get
fine.
That next week. We'll get into it better. The middle term is distributed. It has to have the words all, every, or no. We don't like the word every, of course. We can use it, but normally we don't like it at least once. It has to have it at least one time, that middle term does. So right here, we have to have our, let's go back. Say I don't. No, I don't. All right. Let's try this one down here. This is negative. So the conclusion has to be negative. If I had this one as negative and this one is negative, I know automatically can't draw a conclusion from it. And I'll give you an illustration of why you can't. Okay. I have an illustration in our book down here where I illustrate it. And we can see it just without even understanding the rules of logic. And we can see that that can't be true. Okay. We have to put them in the right form, and we can look at them and we can say, okay, now that's not valid. It's not proper. And most of your arguments can be put in these four forms. And you can, some of them might not, but most of them are going to be able to be put in these forms. Negative and 1 and 2 positive forms. Right. Lay out here. These terms. We have a term called the major term. And in this argument here, N is the major term. It's in the major premise and it's the conclusion or predicate. I'm sorry, the predicate of the conclusion. All right. So here's your subject. And I need a space in there. I don't know why I didn't have one. So I'll save that. Let's find a little typo errors. All C are N. And so there's your predicate of your conclusion. There's your subject of your conclusion. C is. So the major term is in the major premise, and it's the predicate of the conclusion. That's what it is. Okay? Now, if you arrange them in the proper order, and what we have the S term here for this one, S, that is your middle term because it's in both premises, but not in the conclusion. All right, now in these two arguments down here, N is your middle term because it's in both premises, but not in the conclusion. So don't go by the letters, okay? Now then, we come back here and we see the minor term because it's the subject of the conclusion. Let's go back here now. This minor term, the subject conclusion in this form It's in the minor premise and it's the subject of the conclusion. That's probably what got its name minor term, right? Over here, we have it here, the subject of conclusion in the minor and in the minor premise, okay? So it's in both places. And so you have three terms. Middle term, in this case, it's S. It's in both premises. In this case here, you have the major term. It's in these two syllogisms. It's in the major premise, and it's a predicate conclusion. The AC term is in the minor premise, and it's the subject of conclusion. That's your minor term. Those are your three terms. You only have three terms. You can't have more than three terms. All right? Now, here's the definition of your three terms. Following definitions of three terms will aid the reader in understanding the topic. We're through for today. I'm going to quit. We've gone nearly an hour. Okay, I'm sorry. Other questions before I go on? We'll pick up right here next week. And I'll come back and rehash this again, because it won't hurt you to hear it another time. No questions? Okay,
I wouldn't be sorry.